Good afternoon. Oh, I'm sitting down to do this. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We lost our ambassador in the building, but he has been retrieved. And we salute all of you who managed to get through security and find this place. Those who haven't been here before, this is a standing room only crowd and reflects the quality of our guests, and I hope the quality of the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, as I often call myself, an escapee from the United States Congress, and one who is really thrilled to be moderating this debate. Earlier this month, I testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, hours before President Trump announced our withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. My views in brief were, 1, keep the deal. It ain't broke. 2, thank you. I'm sure there are some who disagree too, but I appreciate that. 1 is keep the deal. 2, there are merits to making a side agreement with our European allies, sitting to my right, to improve the deal. 3, transformation has failed, but Iran's malign behavior won't get easier to manage without a deal. 4, there is linkage between the JCPOA and issues like North Korea. In announcing the Iran deal in 2015, then President Obama said, "This deal is not built on trust, it's built on verification." So, in my view, should the so-called summit be back on, the summit between North Korea and the US, Kim Jong-un will have learned that our government doesn't always respect the deals to which we agree, and we will have to fashion a deal which experts view as tougher than the JCPOA. And that will be very hard to do given North Korea's far more advanced nuclear program and its 70 years of obfuscation. 5th point, and this reflects the view of colleagues throughout the Wilson Center, we fear that withdrawing from the JCPOA risks isolating the US and making it harder for us to work with our allies on other challenges. Stay tuned for a few questions over here. Our allies are disappointed by the US decision on the Paris Climate Accord and the abandonment of multilateral trade agreements. Our allies, especially those in Europe, helped construct the world order after World War II, and we will pay a huge price if they move to align elsewhere. So the discussion begins, and we are blessed at the center to have lured Baroness Cathy Ashton to chair our Global Europe program. She is the woman in the arena, the perfect person for the job. Her background as foreign minister to the EU, a life peer in the House of Lords, and former director for business and community, plus her innate wisdom, yes, you have it, equip her to see the connections between Europe and head-spinning developments around the world. Joining her today, and we found him in the building, is Ambassador David O'Sullivan, who has served in a number of senior official posts in the European public service for 5 decades. Is that true?
No.
No. How many
I'm not
decades?
quite that old.
That's not.
3 decades.
3 decades. Yes. Okay. Phew. I was wondering what happened to my eyesight. Including head of the European Commission President Prodi's cabinet from 1999 to 2000, Secretary General of the European Commission 2000 to 2005. He has extensive trade experience as Director General for Trade from 2005 to 10 and Chief Negotiator for the Doha Development Round. He was responsible for overseeing the launch of a number of free trade agreements and concluded the EU's agreement with South Korea. Before joining the Commission, he started his career 3 decades ago, not 5, excuse me, with the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, 1977 to 79, right, okay. I get to moderate this discussion about the JCPOA and other issues affecting the Transatlantic Alliance and to learn from it. Many of you know I call this place an intellectual candy store. Well, welcome inside. So, a first question for Cathy Ashton on Iran. Now that the United States has withdrawn from the JCPOA, what is its future For example, can it survive without U.S. participation? Has the EU received a preliminary indicator of Iran's intention, whether it will remain in the agreement?
First of all, Jane, it's lovely to be here and to be with this audience and to be sitting next to David O'Sullivan. I feel quite honoured to be with him. He's somebody of great eminence. I can say that because he used to work with me, dare I say even for me, though it never felt like that.
I work for you.
Oh, that would be the day. We all work for you, Jane. I think the big question really is for the other nations involved in the JCPOA, because it was, if you recall, Russia, China, the US, France, Germany and the UK, who were the 6 countries. My role in the whole of the negotiation was the kind of coordination and moving the negotiations forward. That this was an international agreement endorsed and supported through the UN Security Council. And its uniqueness was in part that it brought Russia and China, the US and Europe together to find a solution to a problem. And I don't think there's ever been a discussion of that kind or a negotiation of that kind. So it has something inherently fascinating, interesting and really important about it. So the question for those who remain, and David will have much greater insights into the discussions in the European Union about this, is whether they feel able to continue with an agreement which loses an incredibly important and vital partner, the United States of America, and whether in fact the message that it sends about international agreements requires them in a sense to try and find ways to continue with it. But bear in mind that the elements of the agreement that matter hugely in Iran, of course, are the economic ones. Mm-hmm. And economic agreements require business to engage, and business will make business decisions based on what it believes is in its own best interests. And so all of the challenges that come with the... So not only will it be a question of where those nations decide to go, but of course whether it's practical to see it continue.
Well, let me just add a question on that, and then let's see what Ambassador O'Sullivan would like to add to your answer. Is it not true that the imposition of secondary sanctions, so-called secondary sanctions, against European countries that trade with Iran in violation of the agreement, or at least in violation of the way the U.S. interprets the agreement, has not happened yet? There is still a time period to run before that happens. Is there any chance that won't happen?
Well, I can't predict what the discussions between the administration will be, and as I say, I think, David, that may be something that you're more familiar with than I am right now.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Jane, and thank you for this opportunity, and it's great to be beside Cathy Ashton, for whom I did work, even if she doesn't think it felt that way all the time. And it was a great privilege. I think the European position is very clear. It was decided and confirmed by the heads of state and government when they met in Sofia on the Western Balkan Summit, which is that as long as Iran continues to respect its side of the deal, the Europeans will do everything in their power to keep this deal alive. As Cathy says, however, I think the real question will be whether, from an Iranian perspective, if the deal is completely emptied of any economic benefit, then clearly there will be forces in Iran who will start to say, why are we doing this? So I think the critical question is, to what extent is it possible to maintain some continuing economic and commercial benefit for Iran from this deal, which is something that the Europeans are working on, but don't forget there's also the Chinese and the Russians and there are other countries. And we need to see how that will be maintained. We've agreed to do a number of things at European level. We've brought back the blocking statute, which provides legal cover for European companies potentially faced with threats of penalties for sanctions. We're looking at the European Investment Bank investing. We're looking at small and medium-sized helping small and medium-sized companies trade. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to do in order to ensure some continuing economic return for Iran, as long as they remain compliant with the deal and they respect their commitment definitively and unequivocally to cease the development or the acquisition of nuclear weapons, which we believe is a very important security issue for the region, for Europe, and we would even say more generally.
Well, one of the unusual things I thought was the statement by our president before he backed out of the deal, that they were complying with the letter but not the spirit of the deal. The letter of the deal is the deal, and the deal was only focused on nuclear weapons. I'm looking at Rob Litvak, our senior vice president here, who said repeatedly that the deal was a transaction, not a transformation. And we still have the option consistent with the deal, and you have the option, and we have the option with you, of imposing sanctions, economic sanctions against Iran for its malign behavior outside the contours of the deal, right?
Correct. I think, and there were, as you know, following the President's January announcement, fairly intense discussions between the United States and the British, French, and Germans notably, to see how if we could sketch out a common understanding of how we would address those other issues. And I think that those discussions went very far and nearly were successful. Where I think it ran into difficulty was in the element of what's called the sunset clauses. I don't think it's actually the right term because it implies it, but there are certain constraints on Iran which are time limited. Basically the US in our view, was looking almost to change the terms of the deal through a supplementary agreement, and that was not acceptable to the Europeans because we always said, and President Macron said very clearly when he was here, the JCPOA is in itself not something we're willing to renegotiate or amend. We are willing to look at addressing the other issues, including what happens as some of the constraints expire in the future, but we're not going to amend or try to renegotiate the terms of the JCPOA, which, as Kathy knows very well, and as a successor, Federica Mogherini, who took over, it took a long time to get us where we are.
Understood. But progress was substantial on a side agreement before the President decided to cancel our involvement in it. All right, let's turn to trade, which I know is your strong suit, and maybe I'll pose this question to you first. The U.S. trade relations with the EU have already been under stress with the Trump administration's imposition, which, as I understand it, is still delayed, of tariffs on steel and aluminum. Now there is at least I don't want to call it a threat, but there is, I guess it is a threat of secondary sanctions, which we were just discussing. So what are the chances of a trade war between Europe and the U.S.?
Well, I hope that we won't see that. I don't think it's necessary or would be very productive. We are not happy with the prospect of tariffs on steel and aluminium because we don't think that we feel we face a common problem, which is overcapacity caused by overinvestment in China. And we are more than willing to work with the administration. Ironically, today in Paris, Cecilia Malmström, our trade negotiator, meeting, or has met, I think perhaps, with Secretary Ross to discuss this issue, but is also in a meeting with Ambassador Lighthizer and their Japanese counterpart on a trilateral EU, US, Japan approach to China on overcapacity. So kind of there's a little bit of schizophrenia, frankly, in some of this. We feel that it's not justified to impose additional tariffs or restrictions on legitimate European exports of steel and aluminium. And by the way, when I travel around, most of the time I get confirmation that these actually are high quality, high value steel imports, which are frequently an input to American production facilities here, and cannot be obtained in America. They're not even produced here in many cases. So we really don't understand the logic of this. And I hope that, we wished for a permanent exemption. We will see what the President decides in the next 24 hours probably. If tariffs are imposed, then I fear we will exercise our right under the WTO to have rebalancing tariffs on equivalent US exports. But, you know, this is not where we want to be, and Cecilia Malmström was very clear after the Sofia meeting when the heads of government made an offer of a positive agenda to this administration, saying let's look at how we can cooperate in the energy field, in the area of norms and standards, in the area of the WTO, to make the WTO more effective, and also the possibility of a sort of limited free trade deal, which could involve taking tariffs on industrial products, and particularly the 10% auto tariff, which seems to be a particular concern to this administration. We could have worked on eliminating those if both sides were willing to go to zero for industrial tariffs.
Well, on autos, a threat was made last week, but nothing seems to have come from it yet.
Well, it's the opening of an investigation,
right,
which will take many months before.
But U.S. Many cities in the U.S. are manufacturing hubs for European cars, and they're a huge jobs creator in the U.S. And imposing auto tariffs could, at least it seems to me, risk a lot more U.S. jobs than it would save.
Well, I think there's going to be a very lively debate here on this issue. I note that the U.S. auto industry, your own car manufacturers, are not in favor of this measure. So I think the investigation, the hearings, the submissions, I suspect without even foreigners telling you it's a bad idea, there will be many in the United States who will feel that imposing tariffs in this way would be counterproductive, among other reasons, for those you mentioned.
Right, and there's lots of cross-border manufacturing between the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. and Mexico, which is, I think, the primary reason the steel and aluminum tariffs on those countries were not put in place. Because there's the realization that trade helps Americans and helps American jobs. It obviously helps others in the world, too, which is why most colleagues here feel that free and open trade is the better way to go. And with some adjustments, and certainly with the condemnation of the Chinese theft of intellectual property, which the president is properly focused on. Turning to some other topics, Italy and Brexit. Let me ask you again, David O'Sullivan, a question posed by Robin Wright, who is a prolific writer, another one of the great women, who is a part-time scholar at the Wilson Center and always brags about that, which makes us proud. Robin asks, quote, given events over the past year, Brexit, Angela Merkel's weakening in the German elections, Italy's latest political crisis, and the dangers to the euro it has sparked, Spain's impending crisis, the rise of populism and nationalism, etc., just how strong is Europe today? How cohesive, how durable, how effective? And the flip side of that, how weak?
I mean, it's not a question that's easy to answer in sort of 30 seconds. I think, frankly, here in America there is, and I don't disagree with, these are issues that you've mentioned, Brexit, the recent situation in Italy. I think you have to step back and just look at the durability of the European project. And how it has and consistently survived many crises in which it has been predicted that it will fall apart. And don't underestimate the extent of the commitment of our member states to this project. I'll come back to Brexit in a moment because it's perhaps the sort of slight outlier on that for obvious reasons. If you look at the standing of the European Union in opinion polls across the 27 member states, it's never been higher. There's a lot of support for the benefits of European integration. Of course, there are always problems, and there are always going to be. It's 28, soon to be 27 perhaps, ultimately sovereign countries with their own electoral systems, their own economic systems. We've achieved a huge amount of integration, but contrary to the sort of idea that some people have, there's still huge differences between our countries, and this gets reflected. They have different electoral cycles, they have different economic cycles. But I think I've been doing this not quite for 5 decades, as we discussed. And if you'd asked me in 1979 when I joined the European Commission, when we were 9 countries, didn't really even have a common market, would we, in my 40-year career, would I see us go to 28 countries, bring in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe? Would I see a euro for 19 countries, that you can drive from Helsinki down to Lisbon without having to show a passport? You wouldn't even need to change currency unless you stopped in Denmark to get gas. This was the right to live and work anywhere in the European Union. Recognition of professional qualifications. If you're a lawyer in one country, you can practice anywhere, something you don't have in the United States. If you're a doctor or an architect, all the same. The fact that students routinely spend 1 year of their undergraduate studies in another country. These are all fantastic achievements, and believe me, people are not going to give those up very quickly. Brexit is the outlier, because I think in the case of the UK, but I would leave that more to Cathy, there was always a deep hesitation about the European, about what was the nature of the European project, and that I think set the UK somewhat apart, and we now have the unfortunate decision to leave, which we deeply regret. It's a loss for us, certainly, but I think the issue of Brexit, unfortunately, has turned into more of a problem for the UK itself than for the 27, who I think take a fairly sanguine view that unfortunately this is going to happen, but I think the UK still hasn't quite figured out how it's going to work.
Well, last EU question of this kind, Italy, which has been in the news in the last week or two. What are the chances that Italy abandons the euro or abandons the EU?
Zero.
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 Then why is the stock market falling?
Well, listen, you know, President Barroso told me the story once when he was president of the Commission that in the middle of the euro crisis, he had a breakfast with 15 of the chief economists of the banks in Europe. And at the very end of that breakfast, he said, and I think he told me this was in 2011. I think he may have told you the same story, Cathy. And he said to them at the end, how many of you think the euro will still be there in a year's time? One person put up their hand, right? And that was in 2011, and 2018 we're still there, and the euro is still there. Believe me, Italy, it would not make any economic sense for Italy to leave the euro, still less to leave the EU. And that's not what the people are voting for in these elections. Indeed, there is no plan to leave the euro as part of the platform of the Five-Star movement, certainly, because they realize it would not be electorally popular. The voting that's taking place is clearly a common phenomenon of disillusionment with the mainstream parties, a kind of, you know, ticking that box, anything but the above of the establishment parties, and that's what we're witnessing. But believe me, if you look at there's even some interesting numbers in the Financial Times today on support in Italy for the EU and for the euro, and it's still fairly solidly a majority. Of course, they're somewhat disillusioned, in particular by the refugee crisis. And the fact that, and I think rightly so, they feel that the rest of Europe did not offer the degree of solidarity that we should have. So I think there is a certain disillusionment, don't get me wrong, there's no smugness or complacency on my part about what's happening in Italy, and we need to pay attention to it. But the chances that they will leave the euro or leave the EU, in my view, are next to zero.
Oh, well, you just modified it. It was zero?
Zero. No, I'm not going to, zero.
Zero. Okay, we'll hold you to it. You'll be back. So talking about populism and democracy under challenge, Cathy Ashton, let's talk about Hungary and Poland as two examples of changes of government that most people would think move away from democracy. What comments do you have?
So I think, as you know, as David says, there is a difference we have to think about between discontent that is caught up in a wave of what we've come to call populism. But I would define as people looking for quick or simple answers to often quite deep and complex problems. And especially when they feel that those solutions have been taken away from them and are in the hands of a group of people who are not even in their own country but are somewhere else. The classic Brussels problem, if you like. And that translates itself with political movements who then offer those solutions and make people feel that perhaps there's a way that they can be a strong nation and tackle the underlying issues in a populist way. But if you talk to anyone looking seriously and deeply at Europe, what you find is exactly as David says, that people may rail against it and be cross and angry and fed up and want to blame, but they're not much in the mood to actually leave. Britain was the exception to that for a whole set of circumstances. But in the rest of the European Union, you will find that people are still very wedded to the project. And so in Hungary and Poland, I think the issues for all of us are to make sure that democracy works, to make sure that the values that the European Union holds dear and believes in are solidly understood and are recognised to be the requirement, in a sense, of being part of the Union. And though that's very difficult to police in any real sense, to kind of make it clear, make it known, and to be able to collaboratively work together to try and persuade nations or persuade governments or persuade individuals to move away from it. You know, when you meet with the European Union leaders, it is 28 leaders who come into a room alone. They sit together. I was there because I represented the foreign policy element of what they were doing. But they sit together. There are no substitutes at the table. It is them. And they try and work through and thrash out problems. But when they arrive in the room, they are still domestic politicians with all of the challenges and worries of being that. Some in coalitions that are very difficult to manage, some with rather huge problems and crises within their own domestic circumstances. They don't just drop all that at the door, they bring all that with them. And so one of the, I think, great things actually is to watch how they work through the problems. They don't find solutions always quickly, but they work towards finding those solutions that can help Europe deal with the problems it faces.
See why I said she's wise? She can integrate information like that in a way that I think gives us hope. Are you hopeful that a Poland and a Hungary, led now by populist leaders who are moving their countries away from certain tenets of democracy with a small d, can learn through this EU process and perhaps modify their behavior?
I'm not unrealistic about the challenge of that, and I'm not blind to the issues that will be necessarily faced as a consequence of thinking about all that. But if you believe in the idea that collaboration in our continent is about also being prepared to accept the rules that go with it, then ultimately nudging along, doing things gently, or simply the democratic process itself, which I'm a huge believer in. I know it gets knocked a lot of the time, but democracy where people make informed choices is the best thing we've got. And in the end, that will be what will be sufficient, I believe, to make sure that Europe goes forward.
Well, I sure hope that exact statement and that exact process could be helpful in the United States, where we need more collaboration and bipartisanship, something the Wilson Center prizes. My final question is on Russia, small little question, and the threat to the EU posed by Russia. And let me put three issues on the table. One, Ukraine, where yesterday, I think it was yesterday, there was the murder of a Russian journalist and allegations that Russia did this. Plus all the issues around whether Russia's observing the Minsk Accord agreement of, I guess, 2 years ago. That's one. Second, it is the nerve gas attack, the nerve agent attack in Britain, where, again, it clearly, that nerve agent attack has clearly been attributed to Russia, handled brilliantly by the British law enforcement authorities, but clearly attributed to Russia. And third is election meddling, obviously in our country, but clearly in the elections in France. France was very adroit in thwarting the threat, and Germany and probably elsewhere in Europe. So how seriously does the EU take this threat, and what is or can the EU do about the threat?
Well, I'll start, but I'm sure David will have comments about how Europe is very currently looking at within the context of the Foreign Affairs Council and so on. Europe shares land mass with Russia, and one of the big challenges for Europe of the future will be what is the relationship with Russia going to look like, not just today, but in 20 years' time or 25 years' time. And those who are serious about thinking strategically about Europe must also be serious about thinking strategically about what does that mean for the relationship with Russia, both politically and economically, bearing in mind that some countries are wholly dependent on Russia for its energy supply. Others are very nearly wholly dependent on energy. Diversification takes place, but nonetheless, it will continue to be a major player. That there are economic links that exist with many nations with Russia, and that we have had one experience, which was the JCPOA, of a political relationship with Russia, that despite the fact that the Ukraine crisis was going on at exactly the same time, we were continuing to be able to work with them. All of that needs to sort of go into a kind of machination of, in 20 years' time, what would be the relationship that we would wish to have with Russia, not in any way to discount the challenges that we currently face. I don't know about the journalist, because there's a story that he's still alive.
He's still alive, apparently.
We'll leave that to one side. Certainly what happened in Salisbury, and I've said this at the Wilson Centre already, I think, in the last few days, we were deeply concerned about what happened in this beautiful cathedral town of Salisbury, and to this community, and of course to the two individuals concerned, and very proud of the support that we got from our European colleagues and from this country as well. Very, very important to be clear that we stand together at these times that are very critical when you consider what actually happened and what might have happened, indeed.
Well, there was a collective response by many countries, including this one.
Absolutely, a very big response from this country. And that's important because there are no issues that we face that we can all face alone. I can't think of an issue that any one nation can tackle alone. We are, by definition, required to collaborate as much as we possibly can if we're to find solutions to any of the problems that we are confronted with of any kind. And I think the broader question about how Russia operates and behaves with nations who are not allowed to exercise their sovereignty in the way that they wish. Ukraine is an example, Georgia is another example of ensuring that we stand together in saying that's unacceptable. Countries should make choices. We want countries who are bordering Russia to have a good relationship with Russia. It's very important to them. Again, economically, politically. Many have Russian-speaking minority groups within their countries. Many have family and friends connections. This is all positive. This is about people to people. But that does not mean that any country can come in and interfere in the way that Russia has done. And that is incredibly significant and important. So as Europe develops its strategy, which I hope will be in collaboration with the United States, it will be about both the immediate and trying to resolve the problems that especially exist in the east of Ukraine, and the longer term, which is how does this relationship that has all of these different challenges get replaced by a relationship that actually we can see is going to be of greater benefit both to them and to us.
Ambassador O'Sullivan?
Well, no, Cathy has, I think, summed it up masterfully. I mean, we have this sort of slightly schizophrenic attitude, which I think you have here in the United States as well, which is we need to be tough on the things that Russia does that we disagree with, whether that's the annexation of the Crimea or the interfering in eastern Ukraine, or the chemical attack in the UK. The story in Ukraine about the journalist seems to be even more bizarre than we thought it was. So he's apparently alive, but it was a Ukrainian Secret Service operation, but I don't know the details.
I haven't read the tweets.
But those, on those issues we need to be tough, we need to push back. That's why we've kept transatlantic unity on the sanctions. We keep a very strong transatlantic common position about Ukraine and the Minsk process. But on the other hand, there are times when we need to cooperate. There are times when we need to find some common ground, and we also need Russia to be helpful. It's a permanent member of the Security Council. It has influence. So there's always going to be this slightly ambivalent approach. You can't. I don't think you can't see it as black and white. We're not either all excellent friends with Russia, or seeing it as a permanent confrontation with no possibility of reaching out and trying to find common ground on issues where this can still be useful. So this differentiated approach, which is perhaps not intellectually not always very satisfying, but it is, in my view, the only way we're going to go forward.
Well, as everyone in this very smart audience knows, we talked to Russia all during the Cold War, or I guess the Soviet Union all during the Cold War, and we have an active project here at the Wilson Center on the Arctic. And Russia and the United States have aligned interests in many respects in the Arctic, which is now a huge ocean, in case you missed this, because of the melting of the polar ice cap, and might become the transportation channel between Asia and Europe. So lots of issues to resolve. We have 15 minutes. There's a hard stop at 3 o'clock, and the smart people in this audience need to show off. Please state your name and your affiliation and ask a question. Don't make a speech, and we'll get to as many of you as possible. The man in the middle in the plaid shirt.
Thank you very much. My name is David Nikuradze. I represent Georgian television station Rustavito in Washington, D.C. I would like to follow up the question about Russia, and the question actually is about Eastern Partnership countries and occupied territories. Both the European Union and the United States support this non-recognition policy of Russian occupied territories. However, we've seen yesterday that the Syrian regime, Assad regime, apparently under pressure of Russia, recognized independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I wonder if you could give me your reaction on that, please. And my next question is about NATO enlargement. For countries who try to get to alliance, this is very important that Brussels and Washington speak in one voice and agree in various issues. However, after this JCPOA disagreement and some disagreements between Washington and Brussels, do you think that there will be some interests affected after this?
So you got away with 2 questions. For those who follow, 1 question, please.
I'll start. Russia has sought recognition, as you know, before, and has been spectacularly unsuccessful in recognition for the territories, as it would describe them, in Georgia. It's very simple. The policies of the US and Europe align, which is Georgia is a nation with its own territorial integrity. Full stop. In terms of NATO, I'm not as familiar of how the debates are actually now taking place, but one of the big questions has always been, how far does NATO enlarge, and what are the issues when you do have countries where there is not a question mark over the territorial integrity of the country as far as we see it, but a reality on the ground which makes it more complicated. And of course that's why it's done in that way. So as far as Georgia is concerned, I think Georgia needs to keep pressing and trying to move forward and being very clear about itself as a nation, and we have to try and support that.
No,
All right.
I agree with that.
Other questions? Second row right here. 1 question, please.
Sure. Good afternoon. Tatiana Kolmakova with RIA Novosti News Agency. My question is on Iran. The JCPOA was endorsed by UN Security Council resolution, but yet we don't see any discussions in New York. Why do you think it's happening? And can you comment also, please, on Pompeo's speech and his 12 requirements for Iran? Thank you so much.
So I'm sure there are discussions and debates going on in New York. Whether they are being done in a public format or not, there will be discussions because, as you rightly identify, the Security Council was the place, if you like, from which the agreement came. The Security Council, in a sense, gave the remit. It was why it was that particular group of countries, and it was plus Germany because the original negotiations that had started had been European ones many years ago. And therefore that's in a sense where the format comes from. I don't think the Security Council can sit and discuss it in the same way because obviously it's a key member of the Security Council that's decided not to carry on. So I doubt there's much point in having that discussion. And certainly with Secretary Pompeo's remarks, he's come up with quite a long and detailed list that's very much about dramatically trying to add to the issues that were begun by the JCPOA, which, as I've always indicated, was specifically to do one thing. It's what I call the boulder in the doorway. We couldn't do anything else until we'd done that. We were very worried about that. And once that was done, it wasn't the end of what might be discussions or agreements or all of the other issues, which are incredibly important, especially in the region. Rather, I'd hoped that it would be the beginning of more work that could be done to try and tackle some of the questions that the US has certainly raised. So he's produced his list. Where it goes from here, I'm not sure, but at least he's been clear about what the expectations might be. It will be interesting, I think, in the context of what happens with North Korea, because these two issues are different, and yet they carry with them some elements of similarity. And the expectations, I think, on how tough an agreement could be with North Korea are in a sense given by how tough an agreement might be expected of Iran.
And North Korea, as I said, has a fully developed nuclear program,
Yep.
and a history of 70 years of obfuscation, which is a longer record of malign behavior than Iran had. Anybody in the back? Way in the back on the aisle. Yes.
These days, Turkey, the relationship between Turkey and the European Union.
Identify yourself, please.
Voice of America. Sorry.
Voice of America.
The relationship between Turkey and European Union is not good these days. What can you say about the future relationship? Will Turkey be a member of the Union or not?
I know Ambassador O'Sullivan loves this question.
We've never had an enlargement negotiation that failed other than at the choice of the applicant country, and Norway is the case in point, where twice they negotiated potential membership and then by referendum decided that they would not go through it. And so the history of our enlargement negotiations would lead you to conclude that we should succeed. Having said that, to be very frank, the direction of travel of President Erdogan and in Turkey, in my view, makes it more complicated, and it has become more complicated in recent years. So I think, and the negotiations have not been particularly successful, also because of the complication of the Cypriot issue, which continues to bedevil the relationship. So I think it's true to say that while our previous enlargement negotiations have almost inevitably ended in success, I think this one is much more problematic. The negotiations are still, formally speaking, alive. The option is still there, but I think the hurdles which we face in the relationship mean that this is not something that's going to happen very, very quickly, in my view.
Front row.
Hi, Doug Palmer with Politico. I wanted to ask about secondary sanctions on European countries. I mean, on European companies, if European companies are hit with secondary sanctions, how would the EU respond to that? Would there be a potential case at the WTO that could be brought, or are there other tools that you would use to respond?
Well, we're not there yet, and I don't want to speculate now publicly in too much detail. We made the public announcements, which we made in Sofia and in the run-up to it, and I hope that we can avoid that situation. But it is going to be, as we said earlier, a critical issue for how to maintain some economic and commercial benefit for Iran from this deal, since that was the trade-off, as Kathy knows very well. I mean, they have accepted, for all the critics there are of this deal, it is the most rigorous, the most invasive, the most intrusive monitoring and inspection system which has ever been agreed to, and that was hard for the Iranians to accept. And obviously, the quid pro quo was that they would see some improvement in the economic relationship with Europe and indeed with the rest of the world. So we will do all we can to ensure, as long as they comply with the very tough conditions of the JCPOA with regard to the nuclear matter, we will do all we can to make sure that the rest of us continue to deliver the other part of the bargain.
Thank you. Hala Esfandiari, who is the founder of our Middle East program, herself an Iranian American, and many of us were involved in 2007 in springing her from Irvin Prison, where she was in total isolated confinement after being arrested while visiting her mother.
Talking about Evin prison, the U.S. sanctioned today among a number of people Evin prison. I would appreciate it if someone could tell me how does one sanction a prison in itself, that's beside the point. Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned whether that Iran should comply with its part of being part of the JCPOA. The supreme leader of Iran made some conditions in a talk 2 days ago for the European. Among it, he said that the European should comply to the letter of the agreement and doing business with us. And of course, he immediately added, I don't trust them. But if they want to be part of the JCPOA, they have to do that. And he also made it clear that Iran is not going to negotiate over all the other issues, its missile program, its presence in the Middle East, and so on. But we know that the Europeans and the Iranians have been discussing Yemen and the role of the Houthis and Iranian in Yemen. The Iranian have come out with it, and the European have accepted that, yes, these negotiations have been going on. And today there was an interesting story out of Syria, because there was a pressure that the Iranians should pull out of Syria. The Syrian government is giving citizenship to over 2,000 of its of the foreigners who are in Syria. Who are the foreigners? Hezbollah, Iranians, and so on. So once you have them as citizens, how can you leave? Yeah. Any comment on
the question is comment on these current developments.
Well, I think the Europeans will live up to their commitment in the agreement. Of course, the key point, as Kathy said, there will be business choices which are made. And since we are actually, market economies, we are not in a position to command businesses to do business or to make certain business choices. So that's going to be, it's what the market decides in the next few months, and which will ultimately determine, I think, whether Iran feels it is still getting economic value out of this arrangement. We believe there are ways in which we can try and facilitate that. There are doubtless other companies, not necessarily European, who don't trade heavily with the US, who will not be faced with the invidious choice of either trading with Iran or trading with or having dealings in the United States. On the other issues, I mean, I think one of the great regrets on the European side is that we fear that the US decision may make it more difficult to move forward on the other issues than President Macron's speech, I thought, set that out very clearly to Congress, where he had this four-pillar approach. And the first pillar was the JCPOA. Preserve that, contain the nuclear issue, but put it to one side. It doesn't solve all the problems. Then let's try to work on the other issues. And I think perhaps the immediate consequence of the United States decision is probably to make it more difficult to build a kind of international coalition around some of those other issues than might have been the case. But time will tell.
And just while the Europeans are busy using all this energy to try and work out how to do this, they're not using that energy to try and look at the other issues of genuine and reasonable concern to the United States, but I would argue even more so to the countries of the region. So for me, I'm a simple soul. I don't get why you rip up something that works and then everybody scrambles to try and deal with that, rather than leaving that, assessing it for what it is. It does what it says on the can. I would say tin, but he'd say can. It doesn't do any more than that.
Right.
But it works. Then you move on and try and tackle all the other questions, as opposed to kind of where we are now. So as a simple woman, I don't understand genuinely the kind of logic of
that was the feeling behind my comment, if it ain't broke, and it's, I think, the consensus here. We're going to take one more question from the audience, and the final question will be Robert Litvak, who's our Senior Vice President, on the side over there.
Thank you. German television, I have a question for Ms. Ashton. European Union and European countries are very concerned about the steps the Trump administration takes in international politics. What do you think? How should the European Union as such react towards these steps, like to prevent like that transatlantic relations are not threatened that much?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last bit.
Like, how should the EU react as such? Like towards that steps that Trump is and its administration is taking in international politics right now, like what's happening with the withdrawal from Iran and the Jerusalem embassy moving and all this stuff.
The transatlantic relationship is incredibly deep, incredibly important to the United States and to Europe. In its broadest sense, Europe. I just don't mean the EU, I mean Europe. And I think we should cherish it and we should look after it. And that doesn't mean that there won't be times in it when things go in directions we might feel are not necessarily what we'd like to see. And that doesn't mean it won't get challenged, and it doesn't mean that it won't wobble. But But it's fundamental and important to all of us. And I think all of us here have a kind of responsibility to try and cherish it and make it work, and to try and continue to have the sort of dialogue where we may not agree, where we may have some really deep and difficult issues, but where we continue to try and resolve them. That's what I think.
Yeah. Thank you. We're pressed for time. Rob Litvak?
I just wanted to note that the Wilson Center is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and the European Union is, in a sense, a manifestation of the Wilsonian vision that democratic societies with free markets make conflict between states much less likely. And with Russia, which is sort of the defining issue for Europe in security terms, we're now pursuing a containment policy, essentially. And my question is, does that containment policy need to be wedded with a vision of what are the possibilities for Russia if, over time, Russia, as Kennan put it, would mellow and to become a different kind of society? I think we've not seen much of the positive vision of what, given that there is some degree of civil society in Russia, what are the possibilities for Russia if it were to come into compliance with these norms? That may be a topic for another meeting. But
No, it's a
President Putin would often talk about his vision for an economic zone, which would be effectively a way of Russia and Europe collaborating economically. And I think that's a really interesting point to begin to think about what this all might look like. In what the president has said in Russia in his May declarations, he's talked a lot about the economy, about health, about education, all of the things that we all talk about all the time in the context of what we want for our people and for our nation. And he's investing hugely in that. And that may be, in a sense, the opportunity to try and find ways in which we begin to think about this future relationship with Russia, which is about the collaboration of people and is about working on issues that benefit Europe in terms of the economy. It does not mean moving away in the slightest from issues of concern, especially on security. But it does mean perhaps that there's an opportunity to try and think more effectively about that relationship going forward. But let's see.
No, I mean, I think it's a very good question, and we were working on that prior to the annexation of Crimea. I mean, frankly, let's be clear, that I was actually the chief negotiator on what was meant to be a new trade deal between the European Union and Russia. We were investing, we even had a program for modernization to try and help Russia diversify their industry, and we were very optimistic, you know, at one point in the sort of mid-2000s that we could embrace a relationship with Russia which would make it a more prosperous and more successful country in terms of what it delivers to its people, but also a very important partner in the region. And that was all kind of pretty much on track until Mr. Putin kind of decided to go differently. And as Federica Mogherini has said in the past, Russia was a strategic partner for Europe. It no longer is by virtue of the choices of Mr. Putin, notably the annexation of Crimea. We would love to think we could get to a place where we could get back to that for all the reasons that we indicated. And economic development, I mean, one of the tragedies for the Russian people of what's happening is that the economy is actually going downward. And while President Putin has said this is a big priority for him, what he's actually doing in terms of the consequences of his foreign policy is probably to make the economy less successful than it could otherwise be if we had a more normal relationship with Russia as a partner on the European continent.
So that last question was a perfect Wilson Center question. I'm commending you, Rob. And it was in the Wilsonian tradition. Woodrow Wilson wanted to think about a world of alliances, a future League of Nations, which didn't exclude people, it included people. To remind when we were debating NATO expansion in the 90s, there was some hope that Russia ultimately would join the alliance in some form. And we here want to keep that dialogue going. George Kennan, whose family name is on our Russia Institute, the Kennan Institute on Russia, was physically here for a time, and part of his library is here. So on that note, I'm sure you agree with me, or if I doubt you disagree with my notion that we have an intellectual candy store here. We are graced by people who know everything, and by audiences who are extremely bright and interested in foreign and world policy. So thank you to our speakers. Kathy's coming back in 2 weeks. She's off to Britain right now to fix Brexit. And when it's fixed in 2 weeks, she'll be back. And to Ambassador O'Sullivan, I made that up. That's fake. To Ambassador O'Sullivan, you're welcome here anytime.
Thank you very much.
All. Thank you.